Good morning. Good morning. I'm Henry Giles, president of Spartanburg Community College, and I would like to welcome you to this fantastic event. Thank y'all for being here. I know you're going to enjoy the program. Hold on. I know we're going to enjoy the program, so since our speaker didn't get hurt. Almost, but no, thank y'all for being here. If you don't know, this was Spartanburg High School, originally Evans High School. It was built in 1922. We bought it about 10 years ago and refurbished it back to as close to the way it was when we got it, or when it was built in 1922. The original floors, the original lights. The standards are original in here, other than we replaced the wooden seats and seat backs with seats that were very similar to the original style, but were a little bit wider for us adults versus teenagers. But thank y'all for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Miss Lily Lancaster Cola, who is a native from Woodruff, South Carolina, who grew up on their family farm. Lily received her PhD in Business Administration from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 1987 and joined the School of Business at USC Upstate. She taught there for 26 years and retired as a Distinguished Professor Emerita of the University of South Carolina. She and her husband, Mike Cola, who's sitting on the front row here this morning, enjoy traveling and spending time on Lily's farm, where she and her sister Jane grow vegetables in a kitchen garden that has been tended by their family for over 100 years. Mike and Lily are proud to be a part of Spartanburg. They are actively involved in the college, in particular the horticulture programs, and we're glad to have Lily to come forward to do the formal introduction of our speaker. Lily.
Good morning. Good morning. May I extend my personal welcome to each of you to the Spartanburg Community College 2020 Farm to Table event. Our first speaker today is Peggy Cornett, plant curator at Monticello, which is home of not only Thomas Jefferson, but many families who helped to lay the foundation for our nation. Ms. Cornett joined the Jefferson Foundation in 1983. She has served in various capacities, including director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for Historic Plants, before assuming her current role as plant curator. She has degrees in botany and English from UNC Chapel Hill and a master's degree in public garden administration and museum studies from Longwood Graduate Program at the University of Delaware. She has been honored by the Garden Club of America for her contributions to the world of horticulture. Although I had not had the opportunity to meet Ms. Cornett before today, my first visit to Monticello occurred about the time she began to work there. I still have vivid memories of my first glimpse of the vegetable garden at Monticello. It must be the most beautiful vegetable garden in the world. Author Andrea Wolf, in her book entitled The Founding Gardeners, put into words my first impression of Mr. Jefferson's vegetable garden so well. And I quote, "I stood on Jefferson's vegetable terrace with straight lines of cabbages and squashes at my feet and saw man and nature in perfect harmony." Please join me in welcoming Peggy Cornett.
Good morning. What a lovely introduction. I'm so glad you mentioned my friend, Andrea Wolf, who is very inspiring, and she's a wonderful writer, and I do hope you read her books someday if you don't already have them in your library. I'm thrilled to be here. I had a wonderful time in Greenville over the weekend attending the Master Gardener program. Is there an echo here? Is my voice okay? Attending the Greater Greenville Master Gardener Symposium. 525 people were there. Were any of you there? A few hands? Great. And it was quite a exciting event, and people were very enthusiastic about gardening and horticulture, and we had a wonderful, wonderful time. So I'm also thrilled to be here in Spartanburg because I've never been to Spartanburg either. So this is all has been a really wonderful experience for me to be down here. How many people have been to Monticello? Okay, a few. Okay, great. Have you been recently? Here we go. In the last 5 years. Okay. Well, you need to come. But today I'm going to talk to you about Monticello and sort of a narrow portion of it. But I will begin by just introducing you to, in case you haven't been to Monticello, understand much about it. It is really a world-class museum and research institute. And it's, of course, the home of our third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, and it's a United Nations World Heritage Site. The foundation was established in 1923 and to preserve Monticello as a memorial to Thomas Jefferson and his ideas. We are a nonprofit, so we're open even when the government shuts down. You can always come visit us at Monticello. And we really try to preserve, protect, and educate the public about the ideals of Thomas Jefferson, who was, of course, the author of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote these words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Of course, he never lived up to that himself, and it's an ideal that we're still trying to achieve in this country. Colin Powell once described Jefferson as the man who captured in words better than anyone before or since the essence of what makes America special. And so when we visit Monticello today, we're seeing kind of a combination of the ideals of Jefferson and kind of the contradictions in America from its very beginning. But he built his home on a little mountain in Virginia, and we really get a sense of the power of place when we visit this, and also Jefferson's timeless ideas. Today we welcome many visitors to Monticello, and in this site we're trying to really show Jefferson during his retirement years, especially after he retired in 1809 and lived at Monticello until his death in 1826. This beautiful watercolor by Jane Braddock Petticolas really shows a lively scene in the gardens. It shows the family, the grandchildren playing on the west lawn. It's a little bit of a disheveled garden. It's not very tidy and neat, but it also shows what the Monticello meant to Jefferson. It was a place to spend time with his family, especially his gardens. And his gardens were also rather uniquely designed, and they were a place where Jefferson was trying to grow many different types of plants. He was really a plant nut. He was a horticulturist in the greatest sense. And of course, he was wanting to experiment a great deal with all types of flowers, bulbs, and trees and shrubs. The gardens are quite lovely today, especially in the springtime. In April, when we have our flower borders filled with 8,000 tulips that we plant every fall. And if you want to ask about how we protect them, I can answer that at the end of the day. But they are quite beautiful, and we have the gardens really based on the way in which Jefferson laid them out, not only the oval flower beds, but this winding border, narrow border that winds around the perimeter of the leveled west lawn. And in it, we are growing a great multitude of flowers, trying to show this ideal of what Jefferson had in mind, and to show the many different types of plants he was growing from all parts of the world. He once wrote that the flowers come forth like the bells of the day, have their short reign of beauty and splendor, and then retire to the more interesting office of reproducing their like. So at Monticello, our springtime tulips give way to the sweet peas and the hardy annuals, the the larkspur and poppies. And then in the summer, we have a wonderful display of the summer flowers, including the Echinacea angustifolia, which is actually a plant that Lewis and Clark brought back, this purple flowered plant from the plains. We have this very unusual 4 o'clock. It's called the sweet-scented 4 o'clock, which is native to Texas and down into Mexico. It blooms very late in the evening and very sweetly scented, and it's quite unusual. We're one of the few commercial sources for this particular species. Here again is the Echinacea angustifolia. And of course, the many native plants, eastern North American plants, are also cultivated in the gardens. Jefferson was growing quite a broad array of our native plants in his flower gardens, including this beautiful cardinal's flower, the Lobelia cardinalis, which it still flowers, of course, in the woodlands by Monticello as well. But my topic today will be focused primarily on his vegetable garden, his efforts to cultivate such a wide array of vegetables, not only for his own table, but also to help inspire and other alternative economic crops in America. No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth. And Jefferson, we know, spent a great deal of time in the gardens. He kept a garden diary beginning when he was 23 years old in the 1760s, and he continued writing in this garden journal until 2 years before his death. And the wonderful details that are kept in this journal tell us of his great interest in the gardens. But of course, Jefferson was not doing all of the work. There were many enslaved African Americans that were owned by Jefferson who were laboring for his happiness, as you might say. And in fact, one of his primary gardeners, we know quite a bit about, his name was Wormley Hughes. And he was not only the head gardener, the principal gardener for Jefferson, he was trained by a Scottish gardener, and he also was a hostler. He maintained the horses in the stables, and he did a great deal of landscaping work at Monticello as far as creating the winding roads that circle the mountain. So we do know a lot about some of the enslaved who lived at Monticello, but there are many who we know very little. We're trying to reveal their stories more and more as we do more and more research. So Jefferson's garden diary, as I mentioned, he began in 1766, but the year he retired in 1809 was the year that he was really keeping his vegetable garden listings more like a spreadsheet. You can see how they're in columns. He would list what he planted, where it was planted, when it might have been transplanted, when it came to table, and when it was finally removed. And this calendar, this garden calendar, he spelled it with a K, by the way, was repeated year after year, and it was always different. In 1812, he divided the garden into the uses of the plants. For example, he would have a whole square of fruit-producing plants, and then an entire square of leaf crops, and then a third of root crops. Kind of a fun way to organize your garden. He only did it 1 year, but it must have been an interesting exercise. And of course, as I said, he grew vegetables from all parts of the world. We estimate over 330 different varieties of vegetables were cultivated in his garden throughout his lifetime. And many of them, of course, were the European cole crops, the lettuces, the cabbages, the broccolis, the root crops, beets and rutabagas and salsify. But he was also cultivating crops from South America, such as tomatoes, and from Africa, and such as sesame and okra. So I'm going to talk about some of those crops today in my talk. Of course, this is sort of the ultimate wonderful spring garden when you're harvesting your cabbages, or late winter when you're harvesting cabbages and carrots and the like. And Jefferson was growing a number of cabbages in his garden, including the beautiful Savoy cabbages that are very beautifully wrinkled and bluish green colored. I hope you can see that. It's a little light in here for these slides, I'm afraid. But And other cabbages included the wonderful, well, we grow a Jersey Wakefield, which is very much like the bullnose cabbages that Jefferson would have cultivated. These are crops that we really do quite well with if we plant them in the late winter and get them started very early in the spring because, of course, as you know, it's too hot in the south for a lot of these cabbages. Another unusual onion that Jefferson was cultivating was the Egyptian tree onion. It's a walking onion. You may not be familiar with it, but it's an onion that will perennialize in the garden. It has a very strong flavor, but it makes on the tip of the stalk it will flower and make a clump of flowers at the very tip of the stalk, and those flowers will then turn into little bulbils, little tiny onions. And as the stalk begins to decay, it'll flop over, and that whole cluster will root. So it, as the name implies, it will walk through your garden. And it's one of those onions that, because it's a perennial in the garden, you do kind of have to rein it in every now and then. But it's a fun one to grow. Jefferson grew such North American crops as the patty pan squash, which were also called simlins. And he said they are the most innocent, or the finest and most innocent of vegetables, which is quite interesting. But this variety really originated by the Native Americans of North America. But they were well known in the colonies by the 1790s, and they were frequently grown in Jefferson's retirement garden, as well as the gardens of the Monticello's enslaved African Americans. The simlins were used in soups commonly, in stews, and were often cooked with a little butter, salt, and pepper. Yum. Peppers were very important in the garden, of course. The cayenne, the hot peppers, as well as the sweet peppers, the bullnose peppers, the corno de toro, the bullhorn pepper. We grow a great diversity of peppers, and as you can see, this South American crop was well known in very early times in Europe. One of our favorites is the Texas bird pepper. Do you all know that? Anyone familiar with this one? It's, again, another native that was sent to Jefferson from San Antonio, Texas by a Captain Samuel Brown. And he sent seeds to Jefferson in 1812, and Jefferson was hoping it would be a pepper that would be a little hardier. It could withstand the early frost. Jefferson once wrote that peppers were essential to my health as salt itself. And he grew these and also forwarded seeds to his friend Bernard McMahon in Philadelphia. So that's where it gets the name McMahon's Texas bird pepper. Because McMahon also popularized this pepper in his seed catalog out of Philadelphia. And so a lot of Pennsylvanians would actually cultivate it in flower pots and keep it indoors over the winter. And the reason it's called, why is it called a bird pepper? Well, any pepper that's called a bird pepper means that it's so hot that only birds can eat it. Because birds don't have the taste buds that will sense the heat. And if you know, you can buy birdseed now that's laced with cayenne pepper. It's meant to keep the squirrels away, but the birds still eat it. And again, we have hordes of birds that will come. This year we had flocks of bluebirds eating the entire row of the bird peppers in the garden. So they just gobble them up. And the common name down in Texas is the chilapaquin or chiltepin, or just as a bird pepper. It's one you should grow. Well, just in case you've heard the myth that Jefferson introduced tomatoes to America, I will dispel that myth. He did not do that. But he was eating tomatoes, and he was really a pioneer in the culture of tomatoes. He was planting them beginning in 1809 until his death in 1826. He also noted tomatoes in his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, which was published in the 1780s. He said they were common in Virginia. So he was not the first to be eating them and growing them in North America. This variety we're looking at is the Costoludo Genovese, and it depicts the very convoluted, lobed types of tomatoes that were the old-fashioned tomato that you all are probably familiar with now. And they're depicted in wonderful illustrations. Here we see it in Bessler's Hortus Istatensis from 1613. So they were known in Europe. The Spaniards actually brought them from South America to Europe, where they became very popular in Spain and in the southern parts of France and Italy. And you'll also see them in paintings. This wonderful convoluted tomato in Raphael Peel's still life of vegetables with a tomato in 1795. Well, there's some that are quite old. This is one we're growing called the love apple. It's one of the original tomatoes. You can see the hand gives you the sense of the size of it. It's a sweet little tomato. It's a small tomato, not as small as a cherry, of course. But others we're growing from Mexico include the wonderful purple calabash, which actually has kind of a purplish red flesh to it when you cut it open. Wonderful flavor, I think, and it probably dates back to the Aztecs, as far as we know. Jefferson was also growing okra, which again is a crop from Africa, an African native crop. And in 1813, okra was planted as an edging to the internal rows of one of his vegetable garden squares. So he was using it kind of as an ornamental. And as you can imagine, it is very ornamental. It's in the snapdragon family. And if you don't want to eat the okra pods themselves, you can just let them dry on the plant, and they make a beautiful kind of an ornamental dried specimen that you can use in arrangements. These will last for years, and they look like little wooden spears. The veins on the sides of the fruit will crack open, and that's what causes those lovely tan-colored streaks in it. So we love it when the okra goes to seed and dries in this way, because we use them in our decorations at Christmas time. But the fruit itself was also an important vegetable in the Monticello garden. He often grew it as a companion with tomatoes, and he had family recipes that include various types of okra stews, in which okra was blended with tomatoes and other tangy vegetables. For example, he was growing okra and making like this soup that also included peppers, tomatoes, okra, potatoes, and other onions and other of the crops from the garden. You would stew it for an hour, chop everything up fine, stew it for an hour, and serve it with a lump of butter. He also talked about gathering young pods and cooking them that way. Lima beans were also included in that dish, the okra stew. And so I want you to just remember some of these recipes I'm mentioning to you about the sauteing the okra in a pan with water, salt, pepper, stew them till tender, serve them with melted butter. They are very nutritious and easy to digest. How many people like okra in this room here? Oh, good. I love okra. I like it when it's little. But, yeah. Fava beans. You probably don't grow fava beans here unless you grow them as a winter crop. It's a crop that I believe Aaron's going to probably mention. You can talk about it. Jefferson called them Windsor beans. And broad bean is another name. There are other names that you might know more familiarly, like the fava bean is a bean that was consumed in a late winter crop. The only problem for us is that it tends to get a wilt in the heat of the summer. So we have to harvest these quite early in the spring. In fact, it's really good to just sow the seed in the fall. It's a big bean. It's quite interesting. Very old. It's one of the only European beans. Most beans are from North America or South America in origin. Globe artichoke was also a very popular vegetable for Jefferson. He was very proud to be able to grow these artichokes beginning in 1770. His garden book would sporadically chart the first artichokes to come to table and the last dish of artichokes later in the summer. He was cultivating them from 1794 to 1825. Also known as French artichokes, this native of southern Europe has been in cultivation since the 1500s. They're not really reliably hardy for us in Virginia. And Jefferson acknowledged this in a letter to Madame de Tessé, the aunt of Lafayette, when he wrote to her in 1805 saying, "We can have neither figs nor artichokes without protection from the winter." Of course, as you know, the edible choke is what you eat when it's not fully in bloom. But we like to let ours go ahead and flower because the flowers are quite beautiful. It's in the thistle family, obviously, and we dry them. They hold up very well, again, for winter arrangements. Jefferson also grew eggplants in his garden, both the white and the purple. A lot of people also think that eggplants are, white eggplants are kind of a modern thing, but in fact, they're quite ancient. The white eggplant was listed along with the purple variety in several eastern United States seed catalogs by 1825. And Thomas Jefferson was growing both the types at Monticello as early as 1812. Also known as Melangina, eggplant it really originated from Asia, where it was grown for centuries. And here's a very early depiction of eggplant brought into Europe from this Fuchs painting of it in 1542. So it's quite ancient in cultivation. I think it's quite delicious. You can see why it gets the name eggplant when you see the older historic varieties. Tennis ball, this is the tennis ball lettuce. Who knew that Jefferson would be writing about tennis balls in his garden book? But indeed, that's the word he gave for it. And it's a lettuce that's, when it gets quite large, it does look like a very large, loose Boston-type lettuce, almost like a big green tennis ball. It was really one of Jefferson's favorite varieties. He noted that it does not require so much care and attention as other types. It's the parent of our modern Boston race, and it's a black-seeded lettuce, first sold in America in the late 18th century. It's distinctive for its delicate, pale green leaves, which form a loose head. Brown Dutch was another frequently grown variety at Monticello. He cultivated that probably more often than the tennis ball. And he believed it was grown at least 17 times in his garden book, but he believed it was a hardier lettuce even than some of the other varieties. And he was sowing lettuce seed every week at Monticello. In one of his garden calendars, he said that you should sow a thimbleful of lettuce every Monday morning from the end of February till the first week of September. Kind of an interesting exercise, especially in the summer. And people say, well, you can't eat lettuce in the summer, it gets very bitter. But in fact, it was a vegetable that people often cooked, or they wilted it and they used it so that it wasn't really eaten as a fresh green. It was eaten more like a cooked green. So Jefferson sowed this lettuce 27 times between 1809 and 1824, primarily in the fall for a winter harvest. And this particular variety really dates to the 1731 botanist from Switzerland. So we let the lettuce grow in the garden, and it's an important crop for us, and it's also important for us to save seed. You might have picked up a seed list that was out on the table out back, and a lot of the seeds that we cultivate in the gardens themselves are harvested by our gardeners, cleaned over the winter months, packaged, and so it's really a kind of a cottage industry at Monticello. But when you let a lettuce plant bolt or go to seed, it's not a pretty sight. It tends to send this big stalk up. Well, I think it's pretty, but a lot of people don't. And then the flower heads start to form, and it's in the aster family, so it's going to make a little tiny dandelion-like flower that will then have these winged seed that can blow away in the wind, just like a dandelion. So this is how we let it grow in the garden, and it's to the great distress of many of our visitors who are wondering why we're not harvesting and eating our lettuce. And of course, we do harvest quite a bit out of the garden, and we do eat our fair share, but we also allow a lot to go to seed, and that's what every gardener would have done in Jefferson's day as well. The sea kale is a very curious vegetable from Britain. I'm sure Aaron knows all about this one. And Jefferson first planted it in 1809 and continued cultivating it until 1822. As I said, it's native to the to the seacoast of Great Britain, Western Europe, and the Black Sea. And it's a very hardy member of the cabbage family, a perennial cabbage in a sense. And you want to let well-established plants develop in the garden before you begin to harvest it. And the idea is that you're going to blanch it to keep it sweet. So Jefferson, we know, ordered 100 blanching pots from a potter in Richmond to be sent to 500 earthen pots to cover the plants of a sea kale from a potter in Richmond. And the archaeologists have actually even found shards from those original pots in the vegetable garden area. So we cover the plant in the early spring and allow it to grow about a foot tall before it's harvested. And of course, you're going to want to cook it with you can roast it or saute it with a little salt, pepper, and butter. Here's what happens when you allow it then to grow out or green up in the garden. And it's actually a very attractive plant, very ornamental plant in the garden. There are other cranberries that are even grown as an ornamental in perennial gardens. But this particular one is very nice until the middle of the summer. And then for us, it just looks awful. It starts to wilt down. The leaves are not happy in the heat. But then if you allow it to regrow in the fall, it will send up some more nice foliage. And it also flowers in the middle of June for us. So it's a very ornamental plant in that right as well. Of course, peas are very important in the garden, and many people will say, well, of course, peas were Jefferson's favorite vegetable. Isn't that right? And he grew, I think, 15 different varieties of peas during his life, and he mentions it quite often in his garden book. It's one of the first plants that they would go out and sow in the springtime, in late February or early March. And we grow a great number of them in the garden, and we use we stake them with the branches from peaches that are pruned over the winter and apples. Peaches make the best pea stakes, though, for the garden. They're woven together. We have dwarf gray sugar and the marrow fat, which is a pea that is grown often at Monticello. It was more of a pea that you would allow to ripen and allow it to dry and cook it more like a soup pea. Jefferson also encouraged a neighborhood pea contest, and this was meant to be a way that his neighbors could enjoy seeing who could bring the first edible pea to table every spring. And whoever won this contest, whoever brought the winning dish of peas to table, would invite the whole neighborhood over to their house for this feast. And of course, Jefferson, you would think, would win it every year because of this ideally situated garden at Monticello, this 1,000-foot-long terrace that's 80 feet wide and south-facing, so that it's absorbing the heat in the spring. But Jefferson really rarely won this contest. In fact, we only know of one year when he won it. And so he decided that year to allow his neighbor, who always won it, to get the prize, and that was George Divers, who lived at Farmington. So Jefferson relied on Mr. Divers a great deal for seed, and he was willing to give him the honor of winning this contest every year as well. We've been saving seed for many decades at Monticello. This has my handwriting on it. This was our first crop of the Champion of England pea that we collected in 1989. We first planted it in 1989, and then it was collected and was saved for the following year in 1990. And we've been cultivating this pea over the years, and many of these we begin with a small amount as a starter crop, and then as time goes on, we're able to actually even package them and sell them every year. So the Champion of England is another one that we grow in the garden that started out from just a small amount. Fearing Burr wrote in 1863 that the Champion of England was originated in 1843, and it is believed to be the offspring of even older varieties that would date back to Jefferson's time. Robert Becker actually was our source for this 19th century variety, the Prince Albert. He said that Prince Albert was the most popular of all the varieties of English peas in the United States in the 19th century. It was grown in England before 1837 and introduced into the U.S. in 1845. But Burr described in his in American's Vegetable Garden in 1863, he felt that Prince Albert was the indistinguishable from early frame, which was one of the types Jefferson cultivated at Monticello among the 15 other varieties he grew. Well, in 1774, going back a bit, Jefferson was writing a lot about vegetables in his garden, and I just thought I would read a segment from his garden that gives you a sense of his interest in peas. On May 16th, he said, the first dish of peas from the earliest patch. On May 26th, they harvested a second patch of peas, come to table. On June 4th, the Windsor beans come to table. June 5th, the third and fourth patch of peas come to table. June 13th, a fifth patch of peas comes to table. So he was really into peas. On July 13th, the last dish of peas. And July 18th, the last lettuce. Last lettuce comes to table. July 23rd, the cucumbers are from our garden. 31st, watermelons from our patch. August 3rd, Indian corn comes to table. Black-eyed peas come to table. And then this next note, November 16th, this morning the northern part of the Blue Ridge is white with snow. November 17th, the first frost sufficient to kill anything. So I love the details in his garden book that just gives you the whole sense of the whole year going on a single page. Well, in that same year, in 1774, Jefferson had a visitor who stayed for a number of years in our area, the Philippa Matse, who was a merchant and also a wine merchant who was inspiring Jefferson to begin growing grapes at Monticello, and also many vegetables. And Matse, of course, inspired Jefferson so much that entire year Jefferson was writing all of his vegetable names in Italian. He went through his Italian phase. So he was growing the Prezzemolo parsley in the garden, which is probably the Italian parsley, the flat-leaf parsley, which he also grew the curly leaf, but this one was probably the most flavorful. And he was growing the common sorrel, of course, which is very sour in the garden. The name sorrel comes from the root of the word sour, which means sour. But then he was also growing what we call the French sorrel, the Acetosa di Pisa. So this must be an Italian French sorrel. But the French sorrel is really the most flavorful, and this was the one that you don't commonly see in gardens today. But it's very popular. You use it with white fish and soups and salads and French cooking. And it was cultivated quite often in Jefferson's garden as well. That same year, he also began growing the nasturtium, or as he called it, the Indian cress. And nasturtiums are very edible. They're a beautiful plant in the garden. Of course, they really flourish even in the late fall. The summers they're not so happy. But the flowers, the leaves, and the fruit are all edible. The fruit can be pickled like capers. And he was growing the pot marigold, or the calendula. Again, another cool season annual that he was growing as early as 1767 at his boyhood home in Shadwell. And he called it the marigold, Marygold. It's a self-seeding annual. We also grow it a great deal in the flower gardens. The largest list we have of herbs comes from 1794, when Jefferson had what he called objects for the garden this year. And it included sage, balm, mint, thyme, lavender, marjoram, chamomile, tansy, rue, wormwood, southernwood, rosemary, hyssop, periwinkle, marshmallow, and bear grass, which is yucca, in case you don't know. So many of these, of course, we grow again today in the gardens. The spearmint was actually believed to be very medicinal, mint tea for the digestion. A lot of these are medicinal herbs, but we don't know much about how Jefferson would have used them medicinally. But we do know he did like the mint. Of course, the spearmint was also a popular flavoring in cooking, in sauces, and it was recommended for headaches, indigestion, and an antiseptic for wounds. Jefferson also mentioned lavender, and the English lavender is what we cultivate in the garden primarily. It's the hardiest for us, and it was one of the most well-known of the traditional aromatic herbs in the garden, used since the 12th century. In Jefferson's time, lavender water for the bath was very popular, and Mary Randolph gave a recipe, who was related to Jefferson, gave a recipe for lavender water in the Virginia Housewife, published in 1824. She also recommended preparing cosmetic soaps. So people were using lavender just in the same way we use it today. Jefferson was growing sage in the garden, but he was not very successful with some of these herbs. In 1814, he responded to a friend who was asking for some kitchen herbs from Jefferson, and Jefferson said his garden was bare of kitchen herbs as to have but a single plant of sage, and that stripped of its leaves. But for us, I'm not sure if that's a problem here, but our sage tends to get a wilt in the garden in the heat of the summer. It doesn't like our red clay soil in Virginia. He was growing artemisias, which are also strewing herbs that were used to just cut and lay on the floor of the kitchens, to cover offensive smells, and also to ward off insects. This was very popular use for these strewing herbs. But of course, wormwood was also the source of absinthe, which is the infusion that was developed into a drink that was consumed by the artist Vincent van Gogh in the late 19th century. So you're all familiar with absinthe. But we don't think Jefferson drank absinthe. We just know he was growing it. And southernwood, which is one that's I'm really fond of. It's a very aromatic artemisia. And again, it can be a strewing herb, but it was also used as a vermifuge and a tonic for stomach problems, and to relieve you of worms, basically. That's what a vermifuge would do. So I mentioned the Virginia Housewife. This was a book that was published in 1824, and it contains many recipes that were also from the Jefferson household. She was related to the Randolphs and to the Jefferson family. So she also talks about the French tarragon, which was Jefferson's favorite herb. He made several inquiries in 1806 to receive roots of this crop. The French tarragon, of course, has to be cultivated by root cuttings. It will not come true from seed. And so this is the best way to grow it, from root cuttings. And it was used, you can make béarnaise sauces and tarragon vinegars. Of course, it's very good with fish and chicken dishes. And so, again, she has recipes for making tarragon vinegar, which was also called astragon vinegar. And you mix it with vinegar and keep it, and cork it closely, and it will keep for quite a long time. He was growing tansy in the garden, and Mary Randolph has a recipe for tansy, for cooking with tansy. It's a very ornamental herb, and it's from Europe, and we can dry it very often in the garden. And she had a recipe where you, and I'll read it to you, you beat 7 eggs very light, mix with them a pint of cream and nearly as much spinach juice with a little juice of tansy. Add a 1/4 pound of powdered crackers and pounded rice made fine, a glass of wine, some grated nutmeg and sugar. Stir it over the fire to thicken and pour it into a paste and bake it. I think we're having that for lunch today, aren't we? Yeah, sounds so good. She also has interesting recipes for the vinegar of the 4 thieves, which include lavender, rosemary, sage, wormwood, rue, and mint. Might be very refreshing in crowded rooms. But it seemed to be, rue, of course, is a very strong, fragrant herb as well. It will cause burns on your skin, though, if you use it in the summer, if you let it hit your arms. This was also called Adam's needle, yucca. Did you know it's a native plant to our area, all across the United States, actually? And Jefferson was using it as a rope in the garden as well. They used the leaves to tie up the grapevines. But as I mentioned earlier, George Divers was a source of seeds for Jefferson for many crops, including vegetables, the peas, but sometimes he didn't come through either. He wrote to Jefferson in 1820, "I'm sorry I can't supply you with all the pot herbs you want. We have not the sweet marjoram, the sweet basil, or the summer savory, but I send you some marjoram, winter savory in time." So he was not able to provide some of these very common seeds of very common herbs for Jefferson in that year. But it's very important that we understand through these correspondence that seed saving was a very important aspect of gardening then. And we grow and sell many of these in our seed collections. You might have noticed on that list, including all of the ones that we're still growing in gardens today. And we're growing this one, which is not anything mentioned by Jefferson. This is the anise hyssop. It's a native. It smells like licorice. And it's a beautiful perennial in the garden. And so we've decided to grow it because it is native and because it's very popular among bees. It was considered the plant of the year by the Virginia Native Plant Society last year. And it has a very strong, as I said, licorice flavor. You can also brew it into teas and infuse it with syrups and cordials. So I really highly recommend it. I think it would do well here. So sesame was, of course, a very important crop for Jefferson. He was trying to promote the use of alternative oil crops for America. He believed that the benny would be a source that was actually brought into culture by the enslaved Africans here in Virginia. And Jefferson once wrote that, "I did not believe there existed so perfect a substitute for olive oil." And he developed three different pressing machines to try to press oil from it. And one year they had a blind taste test when he was president, and the sesame oil was the favorite. So he had great ideals for this to be an alternative oil crop for America. But his own early efforts to extract oil from the tiny seed did not meet with great success. And by 1811, after 3 years of trying, he had only 2 or 3 bushels of seed and a gallon of oil. So he had only, to show for it. So still he recorded sowing sesame in 7 of the following 15 years. And he had a great belief that it would be a great crop for the South. These are the different ways that he spelled sesame. Benny, Benny, and Benny. But it's interesting that he didn't really catch on the fact that he could have been making oil from this crop, the peanut. He called it the peendar. And it was also called the African groundnut. But it's actually originated in South America, but was introduced to Africa at a very early time. And Jefferson was growing this, he called it a very sweet groundnut by 1805. And historian Andrew Smith aptly described the peanut as an American icon that has attained culinary stardom today. And we all love peanuts, unless we're allergic. But they were introduced actually by the Portuguese to Europe in the 16th century. So they were a crop that enslaved African Americans were fed during their voyage on slave ships to America. As you know, peanuts are a fruit. They're developed from the flower as it sends a peg down into the ground. That little peg will expand and create that nut, and that's what you're going to harvest later on when you pull it out of the ground. He grew some interesting corns. Of course, they're not a corn that you would rave about today, because some of these were brought by Lewis and Clark from the Mandan and Arikara and Hadassah tribes from North Dakota, where they had to grow corn in a very short amount of time, so they had to get it to ripen when it was only about 5 feet tall. And so that's why we're growing some of these kind of goofy-looking corn crops in the garden, but they're a very significant Native American crop. Also, the Arikara bean is a crop we've grown for many years from the Arikara tribes. He grew the scarlet runner bean, the arbor bean, on arbors and poles. And this, again, is another European bean that's quite delicious. And anytime I meet someone from England, they always say they're lovely in the freezer. Maybe you can explain that to me. I think you freeze them when they're fresh, and they are lovely. It's a lovely bean, you know, and it's a very strong tasting bean. It's very good, and we grow this on our arbors along with hyacinth bean, which are beans that probably aren't edible, but they are from Jefferson's period. We're not sure Jefferson actually grew this particular species, but he did grow the Caracalla bean, which is a very fragrant bean, a beautiful bean, and we don't think it's edible. I've never eaten it, but it is an ornamental bean. We think Jefferson might have seen it in Kew Gardens in greenhouses when he was visiting London. And it's not an easy bean to grow, but if you can grow it, which I've been doing for a number of years, I can tell you during lunch how to do it, but it's not hardy for us. It might be hardy here, but it's definitely not hardy in Virginia. Just a little bit about the fruits. I think our time is running out, but he did have a giant, an enormous south-facing fruit garden where he grew peaches, apples, pears, plums, apricots, cherries, nectarines, nut trees, figs, grapes, and also some berry squares, raspberries, gooseberries, and currants. So as you can see from this image, you can see that the scale of that garden, 1,000 feet long. The garden pavilion stands at the midpoint of the garden. And he considered peaches to be one of his favorite fruits. He said one year that we abound in the luxury of the peach. This is the Indian blood peach, which is a very delicious peach. It's a clingstone peach, like most of the old peaches are. They would call them plum peaches. And it has a very red flesh to it. It's very beautiful. You can grow it from seed. It'll come true from seed. And the lemon cling has become very popular in recent years. It was nominated for the the Slow Foods Ark of Taste. And so it's a fruit that we're trying to preserve because it has so much history, especially associated with the South. It was grown in South Carolina, actually, and it was called Kennedy's Carolina peach, or large yellow pineapple peach. And Jefferson also grew this variety. He was growing the Newtown pippin, which had an exceptionally remarkable flavor, especially when grown in the soils of Albemarle County, where we call it the Albemarle pippin, which is a synonym. And it's a fruit that the flavor is enhanced as it's stored. So the last pippin that you're going to take out of your storage, your vegetable storage bin in March, that you harvested the previous fall, will have the finest flavor. But a lot of these apples have gone out of cultivation in the last century. At the turn of the 19th century, there were thousands of apple varieties available, and it's whittled down to just a few. You know, the Golden Delicious, the Red Delicious, and now there's a few others that are popular. But there were hundreds and hundreds of varieties of apples, even in Jefferson's day. He loved the figs, and one of his favorite was the Marseille fig. He said it was the finest fig I've ever seen. And he was very successful in cultivating it, and he even shared it with his neighbors. And it's a white-fleshed fig. It's quite beautiful in the garden. He was not very successful with grapes. He tried growing European grapes in his vineyard, and we don't believe he ever successfully brought a bottle of wine to table from that vineyard. But he loved the European wines especially, and he was attempting to grow some that were very difficult to grow in our region, including some of the white varieties, the white Fronignac or the Muscat Blanc. He said, wine has become indispensable for my health. Well, we got in a little bit of trouble when we were using that as a kind of a logo on some of our wine labels that we made later. But we have been successful in growing some of the varieties he's grown. Of course, Cabernet Sauvignon is a very popular one. Some of our vines have succumbed to some diseases recently, and we're replanting some of that vineyard. Gabriele Rousey is director of the Gardens and Grounds now. This is a picture of him as father of the Virginia wine, the modern Virginia wine industry. But here's that label where we got into trouble, that wine for long habit has become indispensable for my health. It was actually on this label of the first wine we made from the Sangiovese grape. and we were told we had to remove it, so our next label does not have that on it. So I'll close with a little bit about some of the things happening at Monticello that I hope you might take advantage of. This summer we have an opportunity for you to attend an institute at Monticello. Some in this audience have done this, I know. And this year it's June 14th through 19th. You can come and stay on the wonderful historic lawn at the University of Virginia, the rooms that Jefferson designed. And you come to Monticello for several days during that week, and then 2 days you're at the university. And then we have a field trip down to Poplar Forest, Jefferson's retreat home, where we're seeing some of the landscape restoration going on at that site as well. It's a beautiful octagon-shaped house where Jefferson spent much of his time. We have a Harvest Festival coming up in October 3rd, so again, mark your calendar. We have lots of people coming, including our own Thomas Jefferson will be there. Peter Hatch is always on board. He's the former director of Gardens and Grounds. We had P. Allen Smith there a couple of years ago. And Peter, of course, is the author of A Rich Spot of Earth, Thomas Jefferson's Revolutionary Garden at Monticello. And if you want to read more about the vegetables at Monticello, this is the book you need to have. It's a result of 30 years of research. We have Ira Wallace, the founder of the Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. She's the founder and gardener there. We have, last year we had Alice Waters at our Harvest Festival, the renowned chef from Chez Panisse, who was leading, really leading our efforts to promote farm to table at Monticello, and has inspired us to do this in our own cafe. We call it the Farm Cafe now. We're selling, of course, the heirloom seeds through our website, as well as when you come to Monticello in the Garden Center and at the museum shop. And as I mentioned earlier, much of these seeds are collected by the gardeners and packaged by us as well. So I'll close again with a bit of inspiration from Thomas Jefferson, who wrote so much about his gardens and how much they meant to him. This is what he wrote in 1811 to Charles Wilson Peale. He said, "I have often thought that if heaven had given me my choice of my position and calling, it would have been on a rich spot of earth, well watered and near a good market for the production of the garden. No occupation is so delightful to me as the culture of the earth, and no culture comparable to that of the garden. Such a variety of subjects, someone always coming to perfection, the failure of one thing repaired by the success of another. And instead of one harvest, a continued one throughout the year. Under a total want of demand, except for our family and table, I am still committed to the garden. Though an old man, I am but a young gardener." Thank you very much. Any questions, or do we have time? I also wanted to mention, if you're on Facebook, please join our Facebook page. It's called Monticello Farm and Garden. Monticello Farm and Garden, and we post on it almost every day. I'll probably post something about this seminar today, so look for a picture of that. And we're just hoping to have more people joining our Facebook page and our online community. We have a question. Oh my, we have a microphone too. Wonderful.
Wow.
Lovely.
Yeah, I just have a question. How did he, or how do you all protect the fig trees at Monticello?
The figs?
The figs.
Yeah, we do some mulching, but our big problem right now are that the deer like to eat them. They're eating the tips of the figs. We're trying to work on our deer problem. I talked a little bit about it on Saturday, but all the tulips we plant and all of our vegetables are just, so wonderful for our deer. And so we have been fencing, and they're actually constructing a very substantial 10-foot high metal fence around 2 miles of Monticello to try to keep some deer out. But for now, we're just dealing with it. But yeah, but you can mulch the figs with straw or with leaves. Burlap wrapping around them is also a good idea. The figs that are grown at Monticello are actually next to a very warm south-facing wall, which is also a good idea.
Well, yeah, that's what I have. My fig tree is up against
A
a
wall.
wall, and I do mulch, and this year I'm wrapping it. 'Cause
Yeah, that's a good
I actually
idea.
have a Chicago fig, which is supposed to be able to have, survive with colder temperatures.
I would think they do really well here. The only problem is if we have a late freeze in March.
Yes.
Yeah, because that will knock out a lot of your earlier crop, and so you just have to hope that the season's long enough for it to ripen by the end of the fall. But, yeah, so it's a little iffy here because of these late freezes, really.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is Zone 8 here, right? Is that 7? Okay, because we're at 6B, 7A, but the vegetable garden at Monticello is probably 7B or, yeah. Good question, yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Good afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and are ready for what I know will be an excellent presentation by Aaron Burleson, horticulturist for Great Dixter Gardens, England. Aaron studied social anthropology at the University of Otago, New Zealand, before arriving in England in 1996 as a volunteer at Great Dixter. He later studied for a diploma in horticulture at Kew Gardens and spent 2 years at Jerusalem Botanical Gardens in Israel. He returned to Great Dixter in 2005 as vegetable gardener cook. My husband Mike and I had the opportunity to visit Great Dixter several years ago. Like Monticello, Great Dixter is a magical place. It is the experience of a lifetime to walk along the paths where Christopher Lloyd and his family walked. However, one of my lasting memories is seeing Aaron there. In addition to welcoming guests, preparing and hosting lunch, and supervising interns, Aaron kept the gardening activities going as many of the Great Dixter staff were away at the Chelsea Flower Show. In spite of the demands upon his time, Aaron was also actively involved in preparing the vegetable garden for the summer season. At one point, I saw him walking across the garden carrying a sledgehammer. I must have looked surprised because he just looked at me and said, "I'm getting ready to set the stakes for the tomatoes." Perhaps you remember Aaron from an earlier Spartanburg Community College farm-to-table event. He shared information and recipes from his book, The Great Dixter Cookbook. Today, he joins us to celebrate the launching of his new book, Growing Fruits and Vegetables in Pots. Certainly, Aaron demonstrates the best of farm to table. Regardless of where we live or how limited our space, time, or resources for gardening, we can all grow something to nourish both our body and our spirit. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Burleson.
It's a great pleasure to be back in this hall, and I'm glad it's rather cold because maybe you'll stay awake for my talk. There's nothing worse than a dark, warm hall to send people to sleep after lunch. And maybe Jefferson could have done better with his herbs if he had grown them in pots. We also are on a heavy clay soil, and the pots have been very helpful for those crops where they don't grow in our heavy clay soil. So let's get started. I'm going to first tell you about the house at Great Dixter because it's in the central part of the garden. As you move around the garden, you move around the house. The oldest part of the house dates from 1450. It's a medieval hall house, typical to Sussex. It's an unusual architectural piece. There's only 2 halls left like it in the UK, Great Dixter and Westminster Hall, with the tie beam and the hammer beam. So this is the Great Hall. This is one of the rooms that is open to the public. The person that made Great Dixter what it is today is Christopher Lloyd. Born there in 21, lived his whole life. He went off and fought in the war. He was sent to school, but then came back in the early 50s and made Great Dixter what it is today. He gardened and he wrote for lots of different papers, but his main writing was he wrote 21 books, but he also on the practicalities of growing. He also wrote for Country Life magazine for 42 years, every single week. He never missed a week. Even when he had a triple bypass, he wrote about the flowers in his room. So he showed true dedication in the English way. This is the parlor. This is the room he would sit in the winter and write his books. He would sit in the chair. It was a completely smoky room. The smoke came down to about the point where the chair ends, so you never knew if you were sitting in the chair or not when he was in there. You'd have to go and have a look around the winged back chair to see if he was sitting there. Usually the dogs were an indication that he was in there, but that's where he sat in the winter. And then the last room that's open to the public is the solar. This is the room up above, and it gets the morning sun and the afternoon sun, hence the name. And this is where Christopher would come in the evenings and listen to music and relax and drink. This is the entrance hall, and this is leading you on the right-hand side is the old part of the house, 1450. Everything to the left is the private side of the house, and it includes. Oops, I'm turning it the wrong way. It includes a Tudor hall house that was moved on site from 10 miles away. The beams were numbered and it was put up. And this is the summer sitting room, and this is what we use when the other side of the house is open to the public. So it's on the private side of the house. And coming up the staircase into the first floor, this stencil work, you see the blue stencil work is what the publishers used for the cover of my 2 books. So that's the inspiration. That's outside my bedroom door. And Christopher, as a child, him and his sister would get to the top of the house without actually touching the steps. They would climb the lattice work staircase. And this is Christopher's bedroom as a child, well, till he was 38. Him and his brother shared a room, and his brother was 42 when he got married, and that's when they stopped sharing a room. They didn't speak, they just quacked when they saw each other, and I think that was for spending too much time in the same bedroom. But neither of them would move out. It took Christopher's brother Quentin to get married for him to move out of the bedroom. So then Christopher, at the age of 38, had his own room. This is the bedroom that Christopher was born in. This is the north bedroom, principal guest room, and where Daisy would come up quietly to have her children to not disturb her husband. And it's the same mattress that has always been on there that Christopher was born on. And this is the center of my world. This is the kitchen. It's on the north side of the house, dating from 1912, and it's a Lutyens kitchen. And lots of the original features are still part of the kitchen, which I use every day. This is the kitchen drive. This is leading from the main drive down the back area, and this is where the coal would have been delivered to the house. It obviously can't be now. Everything's grown over. But behind those 2 gates at the bottom is where this new book I've written is based. It's the kitchen courtyard, and it's a small area that's a corridor between 2 buildings. And this is it from looking up above, down. The kitchen pig would have lived in this area. The coal would have been delivered into here, and it was just a corridor really between the cold store. There's an outside loo, and then there's cold stores out there where the pheasants and things would have been hung in the winter. But today I've filled it up with pots. And the book was inspired by complaints from visitors. Lots of people come to Dixter and say it's fantastic, but it's not very relatable to my own garden. It's on a big scale, and not many people have 6 acres of garden with a long border the size of Great Dixter. But a couple of friends really inspired me. This is one of them. This is Cornelia. She's completely bonkers, but she does a fantastic display. And this is everything in this photo is in pots. It's in a little cobbled courtyard outside her house, and everything is in pots because it's cobbled, so she can't have anything in the ground. And she has this little area where you can sit and eat, and you can fit about 4 people, 6 people intimately around a table, and you can see what she can do with that area. So it made me think a lot about, you've got to have imagination if you've got a small space, but somewhat you can all grow something, whatever conditions you live in. And this is the inspiration for one of the recipes for my book, was going to her place for lunch. Cornelia is one of those people where everything's about 5 or 6 courses, which I detest as a rule. It takes too long and it's prolonged. So I always say to her, I want simple eating, and so this is a simple starter for Cornelia. And you can see the scale of what we eat on and eat from. The other inspiration is a friend, Laura, who lives in the family home in the Netherlands. They've been there since about 1630, and it's a moated property, and the moat is the constraint for her. Traditionally, people wouldn't have eaten outside. It's a modern phenomenon at a table, and so they can't push out, obviously, into the moat. And so they've got this little area on this side of the house, with this is the kitchen down here, and they've got this little area, there it is, with the espaliers against the wall, pots on the windowsill, they've got citrus trees, they've got all sorts in this little table. And you can pass the food out through the kitchen window onto this ledge and to the table. And it's a very charming space. It's very small, but it's very beautiful. And they also have a fantastic vegetable garden, and their food comes from the vegetable garden as well. And they kill their own chickens. But I'm going to tell you really about what I've done with the courtyard at Great Dixter. These are the kitchen windows, and this is the courtyard. These are the kitchen windows. This is where I stand and spend hours washing up and looking out onto the space. And it was standing at that window I thought about how dull it is to look out there onto nothing. And so I started doing things, and I started originally with species bulbs and tulips and that sort of thing, which wasn't the most practical for a kitchen. So that's where it led on to. And I wanted to have some structure out there. So I wanted to have fruit trees, edible, everything edible. So we've got apple trees, peach trees, apricots, figs, all in pots. And it's easy to get these sort of plants that will be suitable for pots now, because there's a lot more dwarfing of stock. And that's because we're all moving into much smaller houses. We don't have the gardens we used to have. And so people do still want to grow their own fruit trees. And so they've been grafted onto rootstock that dwarfs them, which is perfect for a pot garden. There's I think my favorite crop last year was sweet corn. I grew that in a pot. For the first time. Christopher couldn't grow sweet corn because the badgers, we've got a rodent that comes and eats the sweet corn, that knows that the moment the sweet corn is ripe, it's there, and it'll bust through anything and eat your whole crop. And so I grew it in the kitchen courtyard. The badgers couldn't get to it. The dog I have is a dachshund, which were bred to kill badgers, but mine are absolutely just decorative. And you can use all sorts of things for making your garden much more interesting. This is an old salmon net for catching salmon in the rivers. And it was a friend Perry found it at a reclamation yard, and it's perfect for growing beans up. So you've got to have imagination. It's great fun. There's looking back through the kitchen yard with lots of different pots all doing their thing. The most important thing is I need to get my wheelie bins out through the middle of it once a week. So that's what stops it from being completely merged into one. I also need an area for Conifer to be able to sleep after lunch. Unfortunately, that photo makes her look a little overweight. She's a perfect specimen. There's no weight issues with her, I'll have you know. And that's looking from the bin area out towards the peacock garden. You can see the peacocks. They're not squirrels that have been topiaried at the end. And so that's where I take my wheelie bin once. Well, I don't, but someone takes the wheelie bin once a week out through. And that's looking back from the garden, from the gates, and there's the sweet corn, how well it did. And the rats really enjoyed it as well. So we're about biodiversity, all inclusive, I did have a rat man come and kill them. And I've also been inspired by other friends in London and other cities who are growing vegetables. This is some friends, Nigel and Anthony. They've got a penthouse suite overlooking Canary Wharf, and so they have 360 degrees of terracing. So whenever the weather, whatever the wind, they can always sit in a shady spot. And there's the different display of different vegetables in the city. So, which is, it's, having been so close to the river, they've got that microclimate to grow all sorts of other things. I think one of the greatest pots in their display is they've got an apple tree and a wheelie bin which they move around as needed to show off. And I'm just going to tell you about a few of the crops that I've really enjoyed growing in the garden. This is a Pelargonium artois of rose, a very old pelargonium. The ladies in the Middle East used to crush it and put the leaves in their bra for scent. I think some modern people could do with some of that. And it makes very good sorbet. It's a very good crushed leaves, and it gives a good color to a sorbet, which is always useful in the freezer. Chard, I'm a great fanatic of chard. I think it's a very useful vegetable, architecturally very strong in the garden. This is one called peppermint, and it's got fantastic foliage, but the stems are really beautiful on it. So I think chard, for us, we get 1 year out of it, and then it runs to seed. We don't collect our own seeds, we eat the seeds. It makes a very good steamed vegetable, which you can use just as a green, or you can make it into a tart or something like that. But it usually runs to seed in April, and by then you're desperate in England for some healthy greens. So the chard seed heads are very nice for that. It has a slightly nutty flavor. I like Jefferson grow eggplants, aubergines, but I grow mine in pots. We can't grow it on our heavy clay soil, it's just too wet. And they need the heat, which we don't get as much. So growing them in pots, and I found them a fascinating fruit to grow, to watch the development. They're quite spooky. They look like bats hanging up, because it's quite a noble plant. And in a pot, you're raising it, so it's an individual thing. And then it has these black fruit hanging, which I find intriguing. I can spend hours just staring at them. They're very good. But you don't have to grow all those complicated things. Just having 5 pots of herbs is very useful for the garden. And Jefferson would have done well having some of his herbs in pots. They wouldn't have rotted off on your heavy clay soil. Sorrel, I also grow the French sorrel, fantastic vegetable. We like it very much in March, April, when there's not much else out in the garden, as a salad crop, also for soup. But it does very well in a pot, and in the autumn we just give it a heavy mulch with leaves, leaf mold, and it'll come up early. It is prone to running to seed if the soil is too rich, but a very good crop. But also if you eat it a lot, then it's not a problem. It doesn't have a chance. French tarragon, of course, fantastic in salads and chicken dishes, does very well for us, and we also grow the French tarragon. The Russian tarragon is rather coarse and aggressive, maybe like the people. Mint, it's much better in a pot. The thing about mint is it's a terribly thuggish plant in the garden. I would never recommend planting it in the garden because it just takes over if it likes where it is. In a pot, you can completely control it. It's very useful, especially for mojitos, and that's what I would recommend growing mint for. The onions, different onions in pots, are once again a crop that Christopher never bothered growing onions. He said it was just as cheap to buy them from the supermarket or wherever, because on our heavy clay soil they're prone to all sorts of diseases. But spring onions do very good in pots, and they also foil the smell of other things like carrots to stop. We have a carrot fly that'll lay its larvae in the in the carrot and make most of it inedible. So for us, that's a very useful crop. Peas do very well in a pot, and they give the height and interest to the area. And we grow lots that have attractive flowers, because when you're growing for pots, you've got to think about the overall look of the plant. Because it's on show, it's got to look good. And so there's a lot of good peas that have rich flowers that are just as interesting as the seed pods. Kale, I know a lot of you young people think you invented kale, but it's been around for a very long time. It's just come into fashion now, but a lot of us older people have been eating it for a very long time. A very good crop and very good winter structural interest in a pot display. There's a place in Oregon, they do about 400 to 600 different varieties you can get. And architecturally, Nigel and Anthony grow it in pots. You can see how well it looks in the winter with that foliage effect. Courgettes do incredibly well for us in pots. And unless you've got 12 children, 2 plants are going to be enough, which are perfect in pots. They're prolific fruiters, and I'm always amazed because when we have extra fruit or veg at Great Dixter that we don't use, we sell at the front door, and people actually buy courgettes. I'm surprised there's not people giving them away on this road. It amazes me. And I like the curly leaf parsley as a winter crop. I know the Italian flat leaf parsley is very fashionable, but I think the curly leaf, I always thought it was a garnish, really, and of no value in the kitchen. But what I've found is for us it's very much hardier, and the winter cold brings out a sweetness and flavors that you don't get in a lot of other things in winter. So for me personally, I think it's a fantastic herb, very useful in the kitchen in winter, and you can just eat it as a salad. Very nice. Fennel, another fantastic thing, light, feathery. You can eat the leaves and the bulbs, very useful in the kitchen. And carrots. Carrots are problematic for us because of this carrot fly, but growing them in pots above 60 centimeters stops the fly from going on and laying its eggs in the carrot. And so if you grow it in a long tom pot, and then you have some bricks underneath, you're getting that height, which is going to stop the carrot fly getting in and being problematic. I didn't invent this system. I gave a talk and a lady came up to me and said, well, have you thought about growing carrots in a pot? And I thought, no. And she told, and it's good. And that's why opening to the public is very useful, because you can learn a lot from visitors. Leeks do incredibly well for us in the pot. And it's also useful, unless you're organized and you know there's going to be a hard frost. If there's been a hard frost and you want to go and lift leeks, you're not going to have much chance at all. And so having them pots near the house, you've got a better chance of getting them out of the earth. Potatoes, as I've got older, the idea of lifting potatoes from the ground fills me with dread. I have a summer boy that helps me, different one every year, but usually the end job for them is to lift the potatoes. I'm too old and too tired to do that. But growing them in fabric bags is really good because you can just tip them out. The plants don't look unattractive as a foliage effect, and they have that lovely Solanaceae flowered family, which is an attractive little flower. I've got to give you a disclaimer before I tell you about this slide. Raw potatoes are bad for dogs, but my dogs love them. And I gave a talk in Philadelphia, and I was reprimanded by a vet for recommending, I didn't recommend, I suggested how good the potatoes are for dogs, but then I came back and spoke to my vet, and he said they're absolutely fine, they can kill people as much as they can kill dogs. And I know there's a vet in the audience here today. So I'll probably be reprimanded later. Chilies, I detest chilies. I think they're inedible. They don't serve any purpose to my life, but they're attractive in a pot. So I grow a few, and I give them away. They do look good in a pot display, and they do very well because they've got that heat. And they can be moved around to get the heat that they need. Berries for us do incredibly well in a pot. These are red currants, very nice little fruit, And blueberries, we've never grown blueberries at Great Dixter before, but now that we're starting to grow things in pots, you can manipulate the soil. You've got a lot more chance of having things that would not necessarily grow next door to each other will do in pots, because you choose the soil that they're going to grow in by what you put into the pot. So for the blueberries, we just need to make sure the soil is ericaceous, and then every year we put pine needles on the top as a mulch, and it keeps it ericaceous. And I think they're very attractive to look at. So do blackbirds who enjoy the fruit. But they're very good to look at. They're very nice flowers, and architecturally the plants are very good. They've got the red stems in the winter, and then those little bell-like flowers in the spring. So very good pot plant. Strawberries, another dachshund favourite fruit, and in a pot they're of perfect height. They don't need to bend too much to eat them straight off the plant. And they'll run around, and they'll set new plants in the cracks in the paving at Great Dixter, so it's very nice that they embed themselves. Rhubarb, we force rhubarb in pots. We do it out in the garden also, but it's so much easier in a pot in the kitchen yard, and we just have these forces we put over, and I put them on after Christmas, and so I think by the time I get back after 3 weeks away, there should be some rhubarb. We also do the sea kale, one of the only vegetables native to the UK. Figs do incredibly well for us in pots, and we grow them up against the wall so they get that residual heat, and they love to have their roots in enclosed space. I think the best fig I've ever eaten was out hiking in the desert in Israel, and there was this gnarled old fig tree coming out of a rock, and the fruit was small but fantastic, and because it had had such a hard life, the flavor was much more intense. And so they do very well in pots also. The show-off thing to produce is lemons in England, pots with lemons in. But I must also be honest about this whole situation with growing lemons. I don't overwinter them myself. Mrs. Next Door overwinters them in her summer house. She can afford to keep it at a very high temperature, and it's light enough so her and I can sit in her summer house in winter and drink gin and tonic with lemons straight from the tree, which is a very nice thing to do. Peaches, we grow peaches in pots, and I fan-trained this one. This is when it was first put into the pot, and we fan-trained it up against that wall, and it works very well. And it's easy to protect. If there's problems in the winter, you can just put some hessian over the top, and it protects it from, because they start budding up and blossom very early. And it seems that the weather has changed over the years, and for us anyway, we're getting the colder weather later, so February, March, and so it affects the blossom on a lot of the fruit trees. So you can just go out at night and cover them up to protect them. And there's a little view. Another vegetable I detest is cucumbers, but I don't mind growing them because I love the way they trail up over the brickwork. And you can see those fantastic eggplants at the base there. And there's the cucumber, and it would grow up into the apple tree if it was given a chance. Now I'm just going to tell you about the actual process, the how to do it of growing things in pots. And the first choice you've got to make is, what do you want to grow in? What look do you want to give to your area? A lot of our pots at Great Dixter are terracotta. It's the supermodel of the pot world. It fits into anything and always looks good, and especially as it ages and gets that patina. But you've got to work out what's going to look good for you. Nigel and Anthony on their rooftop, they're much more modern. But this is a view of the pots at Great Dixter with all the different terracottas. But you can also see we've got some stoneware and things like that in amongst. And we've also got plastic. But what we do is we hide it so we don't look so poor. We hide all the plastic behind and have expensive terracotta at the front. It's all a facade life, really, isn't it? As long as it looks good on the outside, we're all happy. And this is another friend. This is Louise's garden on the coast in Hastings, and she too has the terracotta pots, which works again with these slabs. And you'll see more of her garden. She's made use of a small space very well. Or this, you can go to a reclamation yard and find all these old tins, these old baby baths and things like that. And the great thing about a lot of this stuff you'll find is they've got rid of it because the base has started to rust and rot. And that's perfect for growing in because you need to have holes in the bottom. And so it works very well to have the holes already made if you're as hopeless as me with a drill. And this is a little bay tree I brought back from Israel, and I wanted to put it into this metal so as it grows bigger. In a terracotta pot, I think as the root system really gets big and thuggish, it would split the terracotta pot where it's not going to have as much chance of doing that in a metal pot. And I want to keep it sort of bonsai'd so it doesn't get out of control. The other useful thing to think about is old wooden crates. The key with that is, though, not to use tannalized, treated wood, because that chemical is going to leach into your soil and you're going to eat it. So know what was the crates were used for before you start planting in them to stop anything going wrong. And these crates do very well for things like salad crops, things that don't need a lot of soil. Radishes do very well in there. All those sort of low, shallow plants are going to be absolutely fine. And this is an old apple crate. And it's one of my favorite. It's just outside the kitchen door, and it's got lemon, verbena, what else is it? Tarragon, dill, all those sort of things all blending together, and I think it looks very good against the brickwork. And this is my apricot tree, which I've trained, I've espaliered, and it's grown in an old water tank that was up in the top of the house. We took all those sort of things out of the house so they didn't flood eventually. And I've used them for planting up. And the apricot does very well. And in the base of it, I've got alpine strawberries growing, which are very nice, and just high enough a dachshund can't get to. This is a friend's terrace in the Barbican in London. I'd think this is pretty revolting, but I want to reach out to a wider audience, so I've got to include everyone. And most of this stuff should have been put out with the recycling, but people like to do that. Baked bean cans and fizzy drink bottles, it's all pretty hideous from where I'm standing, but each to their own, whatever works. And here's our sea kale. We can't grow it in our heavy clay soil. It rots. It won't go through the winter. And so we grow it in pots, and then we just put forces on top of that. And I think the next slide you'll see, there's the sea kale under the forcer, which does very well for us with our heavy clay soil. And there's, you can see it's earlier on, and you can see all the curly leaf parsley doing its thing. Like Jefferson, I think it's very important to make lots of notes. It's a very useful tool to have a notebook, so you know when you should be sowing things. I haven't gone quite to the extreme of writing when they were served at the table. Maybe I need to have more time for that sort of thing. But it's very useful, and I see the logic in it, because when you're busy and things get out of hand, you don't always remember to sow all the seeds. And especially if you've got, like me, all my seeds are in just a big wine box. They're all in sort of chaotic order. You miss things. So having the notebook, you can refer to the year before to make sure you've got things in at the right time and that you're growing things. So I think as a gardener, it's very useful to have a notebook. I just write down the vegetable, the variety, the date sown, and the seed supplier. That's enough information for me. And I also put it onto a plastic label and hide it in the back of the pot. So if I'm out there, I can just look straight away. The tools needed for a pot garden are much more controllable than a general garden, thankfully, because if you live in an apartment, you don't want to have part of it as a work area. And so I've got these few tools, and I just keep them in a wine case with a sliding lid, which I can get things out, and I can also use it as an occasional table to hold glasses of wine in the evening. So it's making use of that space. I've got some friends in London, and what they did is they had a bench built with the lid comes up, all their tools and hoses and watering cans in that, and then they can sit on it the other time. So you become good at utilizing the space you've got when you haven't got much space. Soil is hugely important. What you're growing edibles in is so crucial to the quality you're going to be eating. And I've read a lot about soils and changes over the years, and I find it very disturbing that a tomato from the 1950s is equal to 9 tomatoes today in its value for your body. And that's because of the soil. We've taken so much from the soil and not returned it. And so I think it's crucial to grow plants in good soil. Leaf mold is a very useful tool in giving organic matter to your crops. Most of our crops, all of our crops, we grow in loam-based soils using the John Innes recipes. And I think the quality of the vegetable that we're producing is very good because of these soils that we're using. Obviously, if you live in an apartment building, having a loam-based soil is going to be much heavier and have a weight bearing on your terrace or your windowsill, and so it's more problematic, and I understand this, but grow your plants in the best soil possible to get nutrients for your body. You can either directly sow straight into the pots, whether it be peas or whatever. Because they're grown in pots, you can cover them over when need be. If you're going to get a cold night or something, you can just cover them over with a fleece and they'll do fine. But a lot of our crops we're growing in 4-inch plastic pots and getting them grown on either a windowsill or in a glass house, and just needs a cloche to keep them warm. And there they are, the seeds on the top. Put some soil, some light soil, just a fine layer on top of that. Water them in and then put them on a windowsill or in a glass house and let them get going. Once they've got their first true leaves, then you're going to prick them out from that 4-inch into plug trays, and that way they've got their own space for their roots to develop. There they are there, and it's just a matter of teasing them apart. If you're like me, I'm slightly heavy-handed with seed sowing, so I always do far too many. So I think they're probably quite relieved when they get their own space, like Christopher was when his brother moved out of his room. There they are. They're like little soldiers in the seed trays. And once they've started rooting out the base, then you're going to take them out and start planting them up into your pots. And there they are. I always work outside in because I think that's where they're going to get the most space and they're going to look the most attractive when they spill over the edge. And if you run out in the middle, you can always put something as a sort of an intended plant in the middle that's different as a sort of centerpiece. And so these little plug plants in the base, and they're going to go around in this pot on the outside. And there they are. And this is in Nigel and Anthony's roof terrace in London. There's the Shard in the background. They've got olive trees. London's becoming, as the temperatures are rising, London, there's more and more they can grow in the central city. And things like olives and all that are doing very well. Potatoes, if the dogs don't eat them all, then you do still need to put them on the windowsill and get them chitting before you put them in the ground. And there they are with an old egg case on the windowsill ready to do their thing, and they've just started to chit. And that'll be one of the first jobs I'll do when I get back to the UK. And have fun with your crops. Don't just do sort of monoculture of the same foliage. And it's easy for it all to look a bit green and bland if you don't play off textures with each other. And so you can see the lovage is there, that's lovage, and then there's a curly leaf parsley. I'm obsessed by violas, and so I have them all over, and anytime I can just put the seedlings into anywhere, I put them in, and I think they look very charming, and they sort of thread the whole display together. And there's that salmonette with a bean just about to start growing up it, and in the base of it we've got lettuces. And by the time the bean has filled out with its foliage, the lettuces would have been picked and eaten. So it's also having that imagination to get the most out of your space. And when space is tight, you want to use it as much as possible. This is back in Louise's garden and down near the coast. And this is in the center. You'll see a photo of this later on. This is in the center of her garden. And you can see that she's got herbs because she wanted it in the center so she could eat the herbs straight from the table, so her guests could sit around the table and eat the herbs straight from the pot. Tomatoes do fantastically well in a pot for us. And what I do is I take all the lower leaves off. Blight is the thing that gets them the most in England. And blight is in the soil. When it rains, the drop hits the soil and bounces back, bringing the blight onto the plant. So if you take the lower leaves off the plant, it can't do that. The other thing to do, which I also do, is I plant around the base of the tomatoes, marigolds, anything like that, so it just covers it in, so you're not getting that bounce effect. But I still take the foliage off. It gives the fruit a chance to ripen in the sunlight. They're not being shaded over by the leaves of the plant, and you can show off how well your cherry tomatoes are doing. These are lettuces with dill growing up, and I'm always trying to give the pot display some dimensions, and I think having combinations like that, a lighter foliage with a heavier plant, seems to work very well. There's a red lettuce with a dill growing up above. The fruit trees will come to you in two forms, either as bare root or in pots. When they're in pots, you've got more scope to plant them when you're ready. If they come to you in bare root, you've got to do something with them immediately. So once you've got a confirmation of shipping, make sure you're ready for them if you're going to go down the bare root trail, because they're bare root, they're going to need some attention immediately. But I think having fruit trees in the kitchen courtyard has given it such beauty, and this apple blossom, it's very nice to be so close to the house with the apple blossom. Watering is probably the thing that can be the most off-putting, and especially if you like to take a holiday in August when you're going to need to be watering most of the time. It can become problematic if you don't have a good relationship with your neighbor. And so that's something to think about when you're doing these pot displays. Have I got the time to be watering as and when they need it? Plants also need to be looked after. They can't just be put in a pot and left. This is a fig tree grown in a pot. I want it to be in a smallish terracotta pot, and I want it to really fill up that space. But it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be fed. And so all I do with that is I top dress it. I weed off the top layer of soil and put in new soil. And then if I want to, I can put a leaf mold on top of that. Your plants are also going to need support as they grow. And there's the salmon net turned up like that, and then the beans are going to run up. They went all the way up to the top and then onto the roof of the house. That's how well they did in that pot. So it's nice to see them scrambling over the roof of the house. Tomatoes certainly need staking, and I find it extraordinary that people will put stakes into a plant when it's growing. I always stake first, because that way you're not driving a stake into the root system of a plant. I find it extraordinary to see professionals out there driving big stakes into the root system, it's not going to be good for your plant. You see it in streets, council workers with trees and things like that, and they wonder why they die after a couple of years. Cucumbers, detestable vegetables, but they do look quite fun growing up amongst the pea sticks. This is a byproduct of the coppice woodland. And fava beans, broad beans were talked about earlier, and we certainly grow them in the garden, but also in pots. And there's lots of different ones with different flowers, different coloured flowers. And the thing about growing them in pots is they can be much more loose. In the garden, you're quite constrained. You keep them upright because they are prone to falling down. Whereas in pots, they can be a bit looser. They don't need to be bound as heavily as they would outside. Things are going to need protection. We don't use chemicals on our fruit and vegetables because we're going to eat them, but we need to stop things like the cabbage white from eating them. And so we use a fine netting for that. We just place it over. The key with that is to have the plant in the center and then the netting on the outside, because if the foliage hits the netting, she'll lay her eggs straight onto that. So you've got to make sure there's always a gap between the netting and the plant for it to be successful. Because once you get those caterpillars, I mean, you can always squash the eggs if you notice them, but if you don't notice them, by the time you've got a lot, there's a lot of killing to be done. The crops are much less when you have growing things in pots. You don't have the quantity, so you've got to use them up as soon as they're ready. And the recipes in the book are much different to the first book because they're on a smaller scale, because you don't have the crop you would have in a big general garden. And so they have to be eaten as and when. But you need to prune them as you would if they were out in the open ground. This is a red currant, still needs to be pruned as it would if it was in the open ground. And this is lemon verbena, a fantastic drink for tea. And it's a Mediterranean plant, so it's going to be, it likes its roots to be much more congested and growing harder because it brings out the flavors. It needs to be grown in the sun to get those oils, but you need to move it on every few years, and it's ready to move on. And it's important to tease out the roots when you're moving your plant from a smaller pot to a next size up. It's another thing I'm always surprised to see when professional gardeners are potting on and they don't tease out the roots. The roots are just going to keep going around and around and not enjoy this new space that they've been given if they're not teased out at this process. And then it's just a matter of placing it in the middle of the new pot, same height as it was in the last pot, but it's going to have lots more soil underneath and around the sides. And then the last job, before watering, is I usually give them a little fish blood and bone. If you're vegan, I wouldn't do that. But it gives them the feed they need to get them going in their new pot. And when you're growing in these small spaces, you've got to use the space as well as possible. And this is Louise's garden in Hastings, and she uses troughs on the wall, and that way she's utilizing that space, because you've sometimes got to think vertically. It can't all be on the ground. And there's her her trough in the middle of her outside table with all these greens that can be edible and be picked straight at the table. Fabric bags. I've become a fan of fabric bags. This is one called Root Pouch, which is made in the US, in Oregon, and very useful. And especially if you live in an apartment block and weight is a problem, you're not going to have stone troughs. Because the whole building will subside. But fabric bags are perfect for that. And when you're not using them, they can be rolled up and put in a cupboard and reused and reused. But this is, a root pouch from Oregon has been fantastic. And the photo I showed you earlier of the beans, that was in a fabric bag as well. And the sweet corn was grown in a fabric bag. They're almost like children's paddling pools, the same sort of size, but they're in fabric. And they seem to do very well. I'm not a fan of nasturtiums. In the garden, I think they're thuggish, they set seed everywhere, but they're good in the kitchen courtyard where it's a stone floor and they can't take over. But they're very nice, they bring a lot of flavor to a menu, but this is a good place for them where they can't do too much damage. I said earlier I love violas. I'm a great fan of violas and I put them all over. And my justification for that is because I justify why I'm growing things to myself, and I think, well, they are edible, but how can you eat a face that looks that sweet? So I'm just going to quickly show you some of the recipes that we've used for the book. So we're back in the kitchen, and the food that's been prepared on the kitchen table is a basil pavlova, and it's fantastic because it has a green tinge to it, and you put the basil into the sugar and blend it together and then dry it and then put it into this pavlova, and the green color comes through, which makes it much more attractive and interesting. But I'll just quickly tell you about breakfasts. This is a Bircher muesli, and something perfect for a pot garden because you're just getting a few fruit every day, and that you can just put them onto your muesli. This is a muffin. My father used to make these when I was a child with fresh figs. Very nice and very healthy as a breakfast. Moving on to soups. Peggy talked about lettuces. Lettuces make very good soup. Lettuce soup is very good. And we don't obviously have the same heat that you have in the summer, so we can grow lettuces all through. They don't do too badly. It's a crop that does very well in a shady spot in a kitchen yard, but it makes a very nice soup. This is Soup of Israel. I named it that myself. And the key ingredient for this is bay leaves, and it's a soup that it tastes better after a couple of days when the bay flavor has gone through the root vegetables, but very nice. This is from a friend in Memphis, Tennessee. This is a lentil sort of winter root veg soup. You bake it in the oven, which I think is very useful for those of you who like to have a drink like myself before lunch. I didn't see one served today. But it's very nice. You can just put it in the oven. You don't need to be standing there stirring it. You can just let it get on with it. And then when you're ready to eat, you just bring the whole thing out and ladle it at the table. We'll just talk quickly about some mains. This is a recipe I made up while drunk. So being drunk is not always a negative thing. Sometimes, Vincent van Gogh, there was a reason he was a great artist. And this is with chicken thighs, and I was out with a friend. Her and I were drinking in the afternoon. We'd been swimming and just hanging around, and we suddenly realized we needed to eat. And I had taken chicken thighs out of the freezer. I had cream, and I obviously had wine. And so we just went and picked some greens, put it all into a dish, put it in the oven and left it for an hour while we continued drinking, and it was fantastic. It was so good. It was I like meals that do it themselves. I don't want to be standing there when other people are out having fun. And so this is one of those recipes. The cream reduced and the flavor intensified. And you can just do any sort of greens as you go. I'm often asked what my favorite fruit and vegetable is. I don't have a favorite fruit or vegetable, but I wouldn't garden without beets. I think beetroot is a fantastic thing. Foliage is very good in salads, and the beet and the root is very good for all sorts of things. One of my favorite things is beetroot hummus, and that's beetroot hummus with radishes, a very nice dip to have with a drink. My whole menu isn't based around drinking, don't worry. Mint, if you're not going to use your mint for mojitos, then I think it's a very good thing to have for salads. Potato salad, and this is the recipe that was inspired by Cornelia with the figs, the fresh figs. We'll just move on to there's peach cobbler, very nice southern U.S. pudding from a friend in Memphis again, and this I really like this tart. This is Mrs. Next Door's blackcurrant tart, and one of the things I like about it is the lattice work looks like the lattice work in the staircase at Great Dixter. And this was her grandmother's recipe. I really like this. And this is the sorbet, the Pelargonium sorbet, which I showed you the plant earlier, Artois of Rose, very nice, and with a bit of shortbread. Baked apples, fantastic. You're not going to get a lot off a small tree, so enough for a few is very nice. We'll just go on to the interesting area. This is a pesto, and it's made with any time of the year, different greens. At this time of the year, I'd use kale as the base for the pesto. Pine nut, I don't use pine nuts. I use pumpkin seeds, Parmesan cheese, and olive oil and a little garlic, and it changes throughout the year. When sorrel's in season, then I make a sorrel pesto, but I use the same ingredients. And I told you earlier about how much I love lemon verbena tea. There it is in action. And this is another recipe that Mrs. Nextdoor and I go to the gym together. And the reason for the gym is so we can talk about eating and drinking. And she had been to a lunch, and they had these fantastic rhubarb cocktails. And so we thought, okay, after the gym session, we're going to do some rhubarb in gin. We never actually tried the cocktails because the gin was so fantastic. We now just drink it neat. Keep it in the fridge, and it's fantastic. Mojitos, mint is very useful, and it is a thuggish plant, so the more you drink, the less you have a problem with it taking over your garden. And mojito is probably the thing to do. This is a recipe for using up small crops of berries, and they're in vodka. And you just steep them in vodka and then decant them and keep them in the freezer. When I lived in Israel, my freezer contained just vodka and coffee. All my friends loved going into the freezer. And I'm just going to quickly end with a few shots of how beautiful vegetables and fruit can be as far as decoration. There's a lot of talk about how our cut flowers are produced. Lots of them are grown in Africa, where the roses take all the water that the people should be having. And so I'm just going to show you that vegetables can be attractive as a cut flower. Everything in these photos is edible, and it can be just as pretty as the sort of commercially grown red rose, if not more attractive. And there they are. These are chard stems. These are the stems of chard. We'd eaten the top part, and my friend who did the flower arranging, he instead of putting it on the compost heap, he started doing flower arrangements with the stems of the chard, and I think it looks very attractive. And there they are. There's some more of them. And the mustard that's run to seed looks very good. There's the chard once again as a star player in the flower arranging. And this is my last slide, and I'd like to thank you very much for staying awake, most of you. I did notice those who did sleep. And if you have any questions, I'll quickly answer them. Yeah. Okay, the question was, why do you put clay pots over rhubarb? It's called forcing. You can start it early. What you're doing is you're having a tender... Rhubarb is very good, but when you force it, it's much more tender and delicate, and it starts early. And it's like the sea kale, you do that as well, because it's too tough to eat outside. But if you force it, then you get an earlier crop. Sea kale is usually around my birthday in April, and it's much more tender growing in that because it doesn't have light. It's like if you eat veal, it hasn't been, it's just had milk and no light. So the question is, when do you put the pot over it? you put it over when it's first starting to grow, and it's going to be much warmer by putting that over it, so it's protected. So I put mine on just after Christmas, I think I did. I put mine on. You've got too many. No, sorry, two's enough. Someone else needs a turn. You need to buy the book. You've got a copy of the book. You don't need any more. Anyone else got questions?
Raise your hand if you have questions.
Yep.
We have microphones on both sides.
What's my biggest challenge? Personally or growing? No, my biggest challenge is having enough space. The problem with growing in pots is it's very addictive. And you realize how well the crops will do, how close to the kitchen they are, and of course the problem is the public come and then tell you about what else you could be growing, or send you seeds, and so it's an addiction, and it kind of takes over your life. That's probably my biggest challenge in life, is addictive behavior. Yeah.
What's your favorite combination in a pot?
What's my favorite combination? Changes all the time. I don't have. I think curly leaf parsley and violas are very nice. Dill and lettuces, because you've got the hard structure of the lettuce, then you've got the freedom of the dill up and above, and then those beautiful umbel flowers. So yeah, it changes all the time. I love strawberries in pots. I think they're very beautiful. I sometimes like just the simplicity of a fruit or a vegetable in a pot. The simplicity of the pot's beautiful, and a bit of stone on the soil, so you don't see the soil, and then the plant. I think it can be very attractive. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, so the question was, how often do I change the soil, and do I add anything to the soil, fertilizers to the soil? I don't use any non-natural fertilizers. I change so depend on the crop. If it's a quick changing crop, it's not going to last. It's going to take a lot out of it. Chard, I wouldn't, once I put the new plants, I'd have new soil, so I'd start again. Parsley, I'll do that. But things like apple trees, you're not going to change them regularly. You're going to top dress them. You're going to put a layer of mulch. Leaf mold, I can't rave about leaf mold enough. And I think it's an underutilized resource that anyone who grows in a climate where leaves fall off trees, you should be storing it. And whether it be in a metal rubbish bin on your terrace or whatever, it's a very useful resource that I don't understand why people haven't used. I love the stuff. It brings a lot. It enriches the soil. So depending on the crop, how often you're going to need to change the soil, because some of the crops are very hungry, others aren't. Lemons, Mediterranean herbs generally aren't going to be as hungry. They like that starvation. The natural oils that you get in those Mediterranean plants need that. When you go to the south of Spain or somewhere, and you see the thyme plants growing out of cracks in rock, you sort of mirror that, so the soil doesn't need to be enriched at all. Yeah. Hope that helps. You've got the book. Sorry, who was the person? Yes. Oh, absolutely. The question was, can you use commercial potting soil? Absolutely. I'm lucky I live in the middle of nowhere, and we use our own soil from the ground. We use, so ours is a loam-based soil. It's a mix called, a man called John Ennis produced this recipe for making soil for potting up plants, and we follow those principles of John Ennis's recipe as a loam base. But the problem with a loam-based soil is it's very heavy. So if you're living on the 17th floor of an apartment building, you're not going to be able to have lots of pots with this heavy soil. But the problem with a lot of the commercial soils is they've got about 3 to 6 weeks of fertilizer in them, and then that's it. So you must look on and see how much they've got in there, because the plant will start to starve if the soil's not rich enough. I think I'm having enough now. I'm ready for a drink. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.